Status quo bias. You're on vacation in Japan where you can eat all the sushi you want. Instead, you eat burgers and fries at McDonald's every day because that's what's familiar to you. But you've just fallen into a psychological trap known as the status quo bias. This bias is based on your brain's desire to go down the path of least resistance, meaning it wants to make the easiest decisions because making decisions is hard work. That's why it takes hours for your girlfriend to decide where to eat or whether she's even hungry or not. So our minds often decide that staying put is easier and safer than venturing into the unknown. This bias can show up in all kinds of situations, from small decisions, like always buying the same brand of cereal, to major ones, like living in the same rundown apartment because you've gotten used to it already. There are a lot of reasons why you can fall into this trap. One big reason is loss aversion, the fear of losing more than the value you can gain. It's a bit like being afraid to jump into a pool because you might get wet, even though you're already sweating bullets in the sun. If you fear that you can't gain anything from taking a big risk, instead of sticking to the status quo, you will likely fall prey to this bias. Another reason is cognitive dissonance. When faced with a decision, especially one that requires change, your brain often experiences discomfort or conflict. It's like when you have a new pair of shoes that are a tad too tight, but you convince yourself they're totally fine because the thought of breaking in a new pair feels like too much effort. To reduce this discomfort, you default to the status quo, convincing yourself that what you're currently doing is just fine, even if you may think deep down that there's a better choice. Anchoring bias. Imagine shopping for a new phone. The first one you see costs $1,000. Now, whenever you check another phone's price, whether $800 or $2,000, you mentally compare it to the $1,000 phone you first saw. Your brain latched on to the first figure as the reference point, making it the anchor. This is what anchoring bias is. It's that stubborn first impression you can't shake off, even if new information comes your way. That's because your brain loves shortcuts. It's your mind's way of saying it wants to skip to the good part without all that thinking. Sometimes the anchor isn't the best or most accurate thing to use when making decisions. Imagine you're talking about your salary for a new job. If your boss says a number first, that number becomes the anchor, even if it's way lower or higher than what you thought. Research shows people usually don't move too far from that starting number, which means you might end up accepting offers that aren't the best for you. So if your employer wants to be a cheapskate, he can use anchoring bias to make that $5 raise or those pizza parties look good. But this psychological trap also affects your other decisions, from what you think is a fair price for a house to how you estimate the height of a building. If someone asks you if the Eiffel Tower is taller or shorter than 500 feet, you will likely guess something closer to 500. It's like someone threw a number anchor into your brain's sea of estimates, and now you're stuck floating around that number. Still, even though you know how anchoring bias works, that doesn't mean you can escape its clutches. That's because your brain wants to make quick decisions, and having an anchor makes it easier. Confirmation bias. Imagine you're convinced that your neighbor's dog is the one that keeps on pooping in your yard. So whenever you see the same dog, you'd think it's looking to turn your Bermuda grass into a toilet. But you ignore that this dog is probably minding its own business, waiting for the mailman to show up. That's how confirmation bias works. This is like a mind trick where you only notice things that agree with what you already believe, and you ignore or forget stuff that might prove you wrong. It's like having an internal yes man constantly nodding along with you, regardless of whether you're right or wrong. The reason why you fall into this trap is because your brains love patterns. It craves consistency and hates cognitive dissonance, that uncomfortable feeling you get when you hold two conflicting beliefs simultaneously. So if you believe this dog is the poop culprit, your brain will work overtime to filter out any evidence that suggests otherwise. This is the same case with social media, which acts like a funhouse mirror that stretches and squishes reality to fit your opinions. Algorithms feed you content that already agrees with your beliefs, so you feel like a genius without even trying. It's like wandering through a maze of mirrors, only stopping to admire the ones that tell you you're right. Availability heuristic. You're chatting with a friend who mentions a shark attack last week. Suddenly you start thinking that bloodthirsty sharks are now all over the seas, treating the nearest beach as a buffet. Even though your logical brain knows the chances of a shark attack are incredibly low, it feels like they're everywhere. You're looking at what the availability heuristic can do to your brain. It's a mental shortcut you use to judge how likely or frequent something is based on how easily examples come to mind. It's like your brain is hosting a reality show where only the most dramatic or recent memories get the spotlight. If something's been front and center in your mind, it's like it's won the most likely to happen award, and when you can easily recall something, you start to believe it's more common than it is. The availability heuristic affects everyday decisions too. If a friend tells you about a great new restaurant, you're likely to try it out soon, especially if they're enthusiastic and detailed. It's fresh in your mind and sounds appealing, so you'd think Gordon Ramsay was running the kitchen. On the other hand, if you had a bad meal somewhere last month, you might avoid that restaurant for a while, even if the chef just accidentally used sugar instead of salt. While this mental shortcut can save us time and energy when making quick decisions, it can also lead to problems. We can overestimate the frequency or importance of rare events and underestimate more common ones. So even if car crashes are more common than plane crashes, news about a recent plane crash might make you feel uneasy about booking that flight to Hawaii. Suddenly, you're more concerned about packing a parachute instead of a swimsuit. Framing effect. Imagine you're at a sandwich deli deciding between two sandwiches. One is described as 90% lean and the other as 10% fat. Now, you'd think that the first option sounds healthier. Surprisingly, however, they're the same. It's just that the way they're framed can make you think one is better than the other. The framing effect is like a sneaky little illusion in your brain. It happens when our decisions are swayed by how information is presented rather than the actual details. It's kind of like when a movie trailer makes a film look like a blockbuster, even if it's just a flop in disguise. This effect shows up all over the place. Take shopping, for instance. You've probably noticed that 25% discount sounds better than save $20. Sometimes the 25% discount gives you more savings, but if you're buying a $50 shirt, the second one sounds better. It's just that the discount frame makes it seem like a better deal. Politicians and advertisers love this effect. They might frame an issue to make it look like it's in our best interest, whether it's good or bad, just to sway our opinions. So when an ad says that 9 out of 10 dentists love this toothpaste, you're more likely to buy it. It's like a magic trick with words, changing your perception without us even realizing it. Sunk cost fallacy. Let's say you're in a long-term relationship that's been milking your finances dry for years, believing that your girlfriend will change and start saving money, but she doesn't, and you're left broke. Still, you cling to the relationship because you've invested a lot. This happens in the psychological trap known as the sunk cost fallacy. Basically, it's kind of like not wanting to leave the movie theater 1 hour into a movie with a 5% rating on Rotten Tomatoes because you've already stayed there long enough. A sunk cost is something you can't get back. In this case, you can't get back the time and money you spent on the movie. The sunk cost makes you feel obligated to keep going, even if the logical choice is to leave the theater in the middle of the corniest scenes. This fallacy comes from your deep-seated human tendency to avoid waste. You're hardwired to think you can't give up in the middle of something because you've already put so much into it. This applies to relationships, jobs, and hobbies. It can look like sticking around in a toxic situation or an unfulfilling job because I've been here so long, it would be a waste to leave now. But to avoid falling into the sunk cost fallacy, you might want to ask yourself if you would make the same choice if you could go back to the past using a time machine. That way, you're cutting through the sentimental part of your past decisions. Dunning-Krueger effect. The Dunning-Krueger effect essentially says that the less you know something, the more you think you know. It's like thinking you can take Manny Pacquiao on in 12 rounds of boxing without even watching a single boxing match in your life. This effect was coined when two psychologists studied people who were incompetent in a specific field. They found out that those guys rated themselves better in those fields, such as grammar, even though they probably can't even tell apart a question mark and an exclamation mark. The ironic part is that they don't know enough to realize that they actually don't know anything. As the saying goes, ignorance is bliss. On the other hand, people who are genuinely skilled in a certain field tend to underestimate their abilities. If you ask Steph Curry if he's the best at shooting a basketball, he might say he's alright. This happens when these guys are aware of their field's complexities and assume that it takes a lot of hard work to become great at what they do. So if you feel you're not good enough, you might be better than you think. But if you think you're the next coming of Usain Bolt just because you came out on top of your gym class's race, you might want to hold your horses and pull the confidence meter down a bit. Overconfidence effect. The overconfidence effect is like drinking 8 cans of beer because you'd feel you can take on the world. It's basically the brain's hype person, convincing you you're way better at things than we actually are. That's how the overconfidence effect gets you. It makes you think you're better than you actually are, even though you're not. At its core, it's a psychological bias that overestimates your abilities, knowledge, or control over a situation. This can happen to anyone, from that person at trivia night who's convinced they're the reincarnation of Einstein, to seasoned stock market brokers who think they can predict the next big market move, but end up buying worthless NFTs. Studies have shown that people tend to rate their abilities above average, a phenomenon sometimes called the Lake Wobegon effect. If you ask a room full of people how good they are at driving, nearly everyone will claim they're the next Vin Diesel, which statistically can't be true. This can create an air of overconfidence, like thinking you're invincible while attempting a DIY home project with nothing but a YouTube tutorial and a prayer. This bias can affect your decisions and how you plan for the the future. For example, you've probably taken an exam in school without studying because you think your math skills are so advanced you're practically a walking calculator, but you ended up failing because you overestimate your abilities. Now, this happens because confidence can feel good. It gives you a sense of control in a chaotic world you can't control. Of course, you tend to focus more on your successes than failures. This makes you feel that your life's highlight reel proves you're good at what you do. But in truth, you have your fair share of bloopers that you don't include in the final cut because you know they make you look bad. We are confident that you like our video enough that you stayed this long. So while you're at it, you might want to subscribe to our channel and join our Discord. Gambler's fallacy. Imagine you're flipping a coin. Now, if you've flipped 5 heads in a row, you start thinking that the universe owes you a tails flip because it's supposed to be a 50-50 split. But that's the gambler's fallacy luring you into a trap. Each coin flip isn't related to the previous coin flip. That means that the universe doesn't care what happened before. This fallacy is like thinking the cosmos has a scorecard for randomness. When you experience bad luck several times in a row, you start thinking that your luck will turn around soon enough because the universe has been too mean to you the past few days. The gambler's fallacy is a cognitive bias, a way your brain tricks you into seeing patterns or fairness where none exists. It's wired to think that in a random sequence, things should eventually even out over time. The fallacy kicks in when you start believing that if something hasn't happened for a while, it will happen soon. Like thinking, the roulette wheel has landed on black 5 times, so it must land on red next. But the wheel doesn't have a memory. Every spin is a fresh start. It's dangerous to fall into this psychological trap because it means losing all your hard-earned money on a weekend trip to Las Vegas. You'll think the universe will eventually reward you for being resilient enough to keep rolling the dice, but what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas. And that could happen to all your money if you're deep in the gambler's fallacy. Hindsight bias. You're watching a horror movie from a director known for jump scares. When a big jump scare happens, everyone in the theater screams in terror, including you. But after that, you tell people you totally saw that coming, even though it's the first time you've seen the movie. And that's because you already have hindsight bias after watching a different movie from the same director. This is what happens when you have hindsight bias. It's a magical crystal ball that shows you the past as though you always knew what would happen. You tend to believe, after an event has occurred, that you knew it would happen all along. It's like looking at a finished puzzle and claiming you already knew where the last piece would fit from the start. This psychological trap can trick you into overestimating your ability to predict outcomes. For instance, imagine you're analyzing a major event, like a company's decision to launch a new product that fails. After the fact, you might think, oh, that was clearly a bad idea. But before launching the product, you thought it was a good idea. You fall into this trap because you're trying to make sense of the past. Our brains love patterns and coherence, so it's easier to reconstruct the past to fit the outcome once we know the outcome. It's like rearranging the jigsaw puzzle pieces after you've seen the picture on the box. In that sense, you're more likely to see how they fit together even though it wasn't so clear before. Self-serving bias. When you ace your exam, you're likely to give yourself all the credit in the world that the only thing missing is handing yourself a trophy. But if you fail an exam, you will most likely blame everything and everyone else but yourself. You might even blame Mercury for being in retrograde, or that the stars weren't aligned according to your astrological sign, but that's how self-serving bias works. This psychological trap is all about making yourself seem like the hero of your story, and the villain is anyone or anything else. This bias helps protect your self-esteem. If you took full responsibility for every failure, it could hurt your confidence. So by shifting the blame, you keep your self-image nice and shiny. On the flip side, it can lead to unrealistic self-perceptions and poor learning from your mistakes. If you're always patting yourself on the back and never looking at where you went wrong, you won't improve. After all, you can't learn from your mistakes if you think your mistakes are the fault of others. The self-serving bias also makes you look at others differently. When someone else succeeds, we might think, oh, they were just lucky, or they had help. But when they fail, you might say, well, they didn't try hard enough. So while self-serving bias can be a nice ego booster, it's good to check it every now and then, because you might need to eat a piece of humble pie to keep that ego meter on the manageable side of things.